Great to see a lot of friendly faces, a lot of friends. How many of you today are working in a startup? Okay. And for those of you who didn't raise your hand, how many of you are providing services to startups? You're running accelerators, you're running development firms, marketing firms. Okay. How many of you feel that when you think about your startup or you work with your client, that the business model itself is front of mind? That's really the essence of where Advantage is, right? Because that's really the essence of my talk today. There's an insane amount of money that is being invested in all the wrong places, okay? And I'm going to go through a discussion of why today, more than ever, understanding how to build an innovative business model is the single most effective and sustainable advantage that a startup can possibly focus on, period, okay? And the way that we're going to do that is I'm going to take you through 4 or 5 steps. The first step I want to talk about is that disruption is the new normal. If you're not comfortable with disruption, you're in the wrong industry. It's not if, it's when. Every one of you in this room is going to get disrupted, right? The second thing I want to share with you are the opportunities that are presented uniquely to startups because of the massive amount of disruption happening around the globe, especially with large incumbents. The third thing, and I think this is where we start to get into the tools, is I'm going to share some research with you, some very interesting research that will give you a historical perspective of where most of the business models that are at play today are being effectively used. And what you're going to learn is that the vast majority of business models are nothing more than creative imitations or recombinations of models that have been around for a very long time, some of them for 100 years, but being applied into different industries with very, very powerful results. Then I'm going to take you on a quick tour of some of the most cutting-edge companies and looking at how their business models are allowing them to achieve unicorn growth, right? Multi-billion-dollar valuation growth. And then wrap up by talking about a number of the tools that I have found to be effective in designing business models, right? So my background very quickly, I've been involved in 7 venture capital-backed startups over 25 years. 6 of them were built in Boston, 1 in Austin, Texas. Was lucky enough to take 2 public on the NASDAQ and to allow 5 of them to be sold to large strategics like IBM and Oracle and Symantec, okay? And we're going to spend some time talking about a whole range of newer business models based on clients I work with, startups that I mentor, okay? So, disruption, okay? It's a word that we hear more and more of, and it is extremely painful to live through being disrupted, right? We all know our friends in Ontario at RIM, right, are struggling for their very survival because they didn't take the iPhone seriously, right? Many, many startups in this new era with all this capital are being disrupted, constantly searching for some ability to get some traction. And so why would we want to study business models? Why do we care? Okay? So we go back to this gentleman, this very distinguished guy named Michael Porter. Michael Porter, the father of strategy, Harvard Business School professor, wrote many books, but he was the guy that first termed the coin sustainable advantage. Now the challenge is, as the great French philosopher said, the future is not what it used to be, okay? And if you look at this matrix behind me, this business matrix from the Boston Consulting Group, for many years, the growth share matrix was the framework upon which large strategics ran their businesses. And in the lower left-hand corner, we had something called the cash cow. What the cash cow basically said is that we can assume that once we got to critical mass, once we got to scale, we can drive the growth of some of our other businesses, our next generation businesses, our future stars, through the cash we generate from our core business, because we can expect a decade or a generation of stability. Well, I'm going to tell you right now, those days are long over, okay? And the great Jack Welch, the CEO who created more wealth during his tenure than any CEO in history, makes a very simple but very difficult statement to abide by. Change before you have to. Human nature being what it is, most people do not like to change. They may tell you they like it, but they don't, okay? So when you ask the average large company CEO, are you prepared for disruption? Of course they're going to say yes. Yes, we're prepared for disruption. So if you asked Wayne Huizenga and the team that led Blockbuster, are you prepared for disruption? What would Wayne Huizenga have said? Yeah, we're prepared. Why? Because we don't expect to be disrupted, okay? We don't expect to be disrupted because we're not taking the challenger seriously. So here's a classic sports photograph, an iconic photo of Muhammad Ali. At the time, he was known as Cassius Clay. He had recently won a gold medal in the heavyweight division boxing for the United States Olympic team in the 1960 Olympics, okay? And he was that brash, outspoken guy that was every bit the startup that many of you aspire to be. And the guy taking a short cat nap on the canvas right there, his name is Sonny Liston. Sonny Liston is Blockbuster. Sonny Liston is BlackBerry. Sonny Liston is Kodak. Sonny Liston is Nokia, okay? Not taking seriously the threat of a new business model. And what happened to Blockbuster was classic. Blockbuster's primary way to drive profit was to essentially take advantage or exploit procrastination as a consequence of human nature. 20% of their business were late fees, okay? People hated paying late fees, but they had no choice. Blockbuster also wanted to be your mother. They wanted to tell you, yes, you can rent a movie, but you must bring it back in 24 hours, okay? Even if your plans changed and you didn't have time to watch the movie, bring it back anyway, right? So you can spend a lot of time analyzing the Blockbuster business model, but Reed Hastings said there's got to be a better approach. And Hastings combined a number of different business models, including things we'll study a little bit later in the presentation. First and foremost, the subscription model, which is you can keep a movie for a day, a year, or a decade if you want to. You're going to pay us a monthly subscription, and we're going to treat you like the adult you are. You keep the movie as long as you want. They also embraced the long tail model. The long tail model was it's not about the 25 blockbuster movies that are on the shelf at the brick and mortar store down the street. Netflix was actually very critical to the formation of the independent film movement and what we now know today as Sundance, right? So they took a number of different existing business models, they combined them, and the rest is history, okay? And so what we're seeing today is not so much the rise, but the fall of a lot of the great powers. What's remarkable is that over the last 15 years, over half of the companies on the Fortune 500 have fallen off the list. And if you think that's shocking, okay, then you haven't really studied Charlie Darwin, okay? And the thing that I'm going to tell you is it's not getting better, it's actually getting worse for the Fortune 100, right? It's accelerating. And so over the 10-year period from 2003 to 2013, 70% of these companies have basically lost their leadership position, okay? It used to be, if you started a company sometime in the 1900s all the way to the 1950s, you could expect a life of about 75 years. Average lifespan of a company that had gotten to cash flow break even. Those numbers today are between 12 and 15 years and falling quickly, okay? Has great implications for everybody in the room. Now, when you go and study where the vast majority of investment is made, and I promise you most of you in the room are probably doing exactly the same thing, it's in product innovation and it's in service innovation. And we could spend the next 8 hours talking about all the companies that were leaders in their product category for a moment in time. One of the great examples was a product that was awesome until it wasn't. I don't know how many of you used the flipcorder, but the flipcorder was an awesome invention until Apple came out with the iPhone and put HD video in it. Cisco spent $1 billion on this company, and they wrote it off 6 months later because the minute that the iPhone had HD video, this had no reason for being, okay? Look at the mobile handset market. A few years ago, it was HTC, and then it was LG. And then all of a sudden, oh my God, Samsung is going to bypass Apple. Well, last 9 quarters, I think we all know that's not going to happen, right? So if you compete in hardware and you try to stay ahead, it is a slippery slope. And there is no way, no matter how much capital you have, that that's a winning long-term strategy, okay? Wikipedia. Wikipedia is a very different model. It's not a hardware model. They're actually using a fairly advanced business model, right? They're using a hybrid of a number of business models, including the open innovation model, the crowdsource model. But what they have failed to understand is when you work in a community context, you have to communicate with your community and you have to provide them the tools to be productive. And right now we've seen a dramatic decline in the number of people editing on Wikipedia. We used to have 60 guest editors a month. We're down to 1. Okay? So even with a relatively advanced business model, if you're not executing it properly, it's not going to work. Reddit is another great example that's been in the news over the last couple of weeks for exactly the same reasons. Okay? So we are living in an entrepreneurial renaissance. And I used this slide the first time to give a TEDx talk here 2 years ago where I talked about the future of crowdfunding, right? There has never been a better time to be an entrepreneur. So how many of you are from outside Montreal? Wow. Look around the room. Okay? How many of you are from Europe? Okay? Anyone from Asia? No? Okay, a few. Latin America. Okay? So you all are here because although we heard from Adeo Resse earlier this morning, right? And Adeo is living in a zip code that has a Silicon Valley zip code. So yes, there is a physical place called Silicon Valley. But more and more, Silicon Valley is a mindset, right? And that's what the International Startup Festival is all about. It's for all of us who are members of this community to share best practices around that mindset, right? Even in Europe, who would have guessed, even just a couple of years ago, that 13 European companies would achieve unicorn status. Unicorn status is a startup that has achieved at least $1 billion in market cap, okay? So the market has gotten broad and participative. We're seeing all kinds of activity in China, right? For every US sharing economy company, there's another Chinese parallel that's operating at the same valuation, okay? Remarkable things going on in the Chinese market, okay? So we are experiencing a revolution, okay? And this revolution, of course, is a digital revolution. And I don't need to tell you about all the tools because you're all out there creating and leveraging these tools, okay? But as Che Guevara said, right, you are all revolutionaries, right? By definition, and Adeo talked about this earlier, right? It's about having impact. It's about affecting positive change in the world, especially with the millennial generation. They're about more than just making money. They want to drive change, but they want to drive positive social impact while they're creating change, okay? Now, one way to foment a revolution comes from Travis, okay, the CEO of Uber, okay? He's a take-no-prisoners kind of guy, and he went into this. There couldn't have been a better CEO to drive the business model of Uber than Travis, okay? So this, I was in London a year ago in June. This is Trafalgar Square, and this is a very staid British Taxi Association protest about Uber. Flash forward a year. This is how the French voiced their displeasure with Uber. I don't know how many of you have been watching the news lately, but in France and Paris recently, they were attacking Uber drivers. They were attacking Uber passengers. They were turning over cars. They were lighting them on fire, right? So make no mistake, there is a revolution happening right now, okay? The difference, though, that we have to understand is that the companies that are leading these revolutions, the ones that are becoming the iconic names that we know, that we all know, regardless of where we live in the world, do it through creating new business models, okay? And so Bob Higgins, who extremely successful VC from Highland Capital, based in multiple locations, including Boston, Silicon Valley, and Switzerland. Where VCs fail is when we back technology. Where we succeed is when we back new, innovative, disruptive business models, okay? So we have seen wave after wave of digital disruption. The iPhone and the iPod created a completely different paradigm for consumption of music. Spotify is now disrupting it, and only in the last month, Apple has responded. Even though they know they're going to cannibalize their iTunes market, they recognize that they have to do this. Obviously, Blockbuster got decimated by the new model that Netflix created. In the world of finance, we're going to talk about Kensho a little bit later. In automotive, we look at Tesla creating a completely new approach to manufacturing what are no longer cars but computers with wheels and selling it direct to the consumer through shopping malls. We've seen so much disruption in education, including the Khan Academy. These are all new business models that are driving this change. And of course, today, the sharing economy is something that we're all participants in on some level. A whole new business model that is being replicated time and again across any imaginable category, okay? And of course, many of the names that we know and love. Airbnb today has a higher market cap than the Marriott, even though the Marriott has 40,000 hotels and Airbnb has 0. Even though the Marriott has 20,000 employees and Airbnb has 200, okay? Remarkable, okay? So if you don't have a competitive advantage, you shouldn't compete, right? Pretty straightforward advice, again, from a straight-talking guy, okay? And so if you're in the Renaissance, as you are, how are you going to compete, right? And what I would say is you could fill this hall with all of the books that have been written about innovation, okay? Most of them are not worth the paper they're printed on. Some of them are exceptional. But if I was to net out for you what these books tell you, it's rather interesting, okay? There's a organization known as Doblin, and Doblin has studied innovation, and they've looked at how innovation investments are made and the wealth creation from those investments. And all of this is online, guys. I know you're taking photos, but this is very easily found online. Just look up Doblin, D-O-B-L-I-N, okay? So not surprisingly, right here in the center, right, which is where the typical startup invests most of its capital, we're going to create an awesome product. Just look at this Pareto chart. Look at how much more investment is being made in product system performance. Look at how little investment is being made in business model innovation and networking innovation, okay? Anybody read The Money or watch the movie Moneyball? Anybody know that story, right? So what was the whole principle of Moneyball? Moneyball was, for 100 years, people recruited athletes to play ball and paid them money based on factors that turned out not to be all that indicative of how they would perform. And only in the last 15 years have we seen this new sabermetrics, where people are starting to understand, oh my God, we've been hiring athletes for all the wrong reasons, for all the wrong stats. Well, what this is Moneyball for startups, okay? And what we find, and this slide is in Spanish, so for my Spanish friends, you can do a better job of reading it than the rest of us can. This is the Pareto principle on steroids. 2% of the projects generate 90% of the upside wealth creation, okay? Think about that for about 10 seconds, okay? So it's just like Moneyball. Why are we chasing athletes for the wrong reasons? Why are we continuing to invest in product when we're getting such limited return and where the sustainability is certain to be very limited, okay? So the number 55 is a very interesting round number. It turns out that if you study business models, if you look at all of the relevant business models that companies are using today to manage their own startups or manage their own large companies, there are 55 business models, essentially. And if we catalog those, we can pretty much put any company into any one of those categories, okay? Which I find to be fascinating. This is coming from a book called The Business Model Navigator, okay? And what it turns out to be is that the vast majority of business models are not new. They are either extremely well-formed imitations, or they are a recombination of multiple business models, a mashup, if you will. So let's look at this company. How many men have a Gillette razor at home? They are still the king of razors, and it turns out the man's name was King Gillette. What a great name, huh? King Gillette started the Gillette Safety Razor Company in 1904. And what was fascinating is that people thought that it was effeminate for a man was a sissy if he needed a safety razor, because real men shaved with straight razors, which are basically little mini meat cleavers, okay? That's pretty much what they are, right? But more importantly than the product category, although of course Gillette went on to become the dominant force in shaving, and they are now owned by Procter & Gamble, and they're a multi-billion-dollar company, was the business model, the classic razor model business model, okay? You can thank King Gillette for that. Now, it turns out that that business model has been replicated time and again and again. So how many people have an espresso machine at home? That is a classic razor blade business model. I'll give you that machine for a very low cost, but man, I'm going to charge you for those pods, okay? Or Hewlett-Packard, right? Hewlett-Packard at one time in the 1980s was the most innovative company in the world. And more recently, 97% of the entire company's profit, a $100 billion revenue company, 97% of their profit came from printer ink. Can you imagine that? That's insanity, right? And so, and this is the one that blows me away. So I worked at McKinsey for a while, and one of my clients, I'm a mechanical engineer, so one of my clients was Pratt & Whitney Aircraft. And of course, you've got a Pratt & Whitney aircraft engine operation here in Montreal. I had no idea until I did a study with them. They would literally give away these multi-million-dollar aircraft engines at cost. Why? Because once you bolt an engine onto an aircraft, it ain't going nowhere, okay? 30 years of guaranteed, no discount spare parts business. You're taking money to the bank. Only the mafia gets better margins than those guys, okay? And it's close, right? So now, how many people know this crazy dude? Okay? So this is Mike of the Dollar Shave Club. Mike is a very brash American, let me tell you, okay? When people around the world think of who an American is, this is their guy right here. And if you haven't seen this video, you need to do that. They got 20 million hits on YouTube. There's two things that are fascinating about Dollar Shave Club. The first thing that's fascinating is that, one, they looked at the subscription model from Salesforce.com and Netflix, okay? Don't go buy blades, subscribe, and we're going to mail them to you every month. But what's even more interesting is the company that created the razor blade model was so concerned about being disrupted that you can now buy a Gillette razor through a subscription service. And I guarantee you that would have never happened if Mikey hadn't come through with this extremely provocative video that got 20 million hits on YouTube, right? So this is one example of how these things evolve, okay? Now, here in Quebec, we have a very different model. We have what's called the Aikido model, right? And Aikido, of course, is a martial art where you use the force of the attacker and you turn it against them. And so Swatch is an example of sort of the anti-watch. Okay? Cirque du Soleil, of course, is the anti-circus. And the Cirque had one hell of a run. Now, Cirque, I understand, was just sold recently, or most of the business was sold, but they had one hell of a quarter of a century run using this kind of model. Okay? So this is the Aikido model. Okay? Now, the freemium model. How many of you are running a freemium model today in your own companies? Okay? So a reasonable number of you, right? We can actually thank Hotmail, the first internet mail service, okay, that of course was acquired and then destroyed by Microsoft, like so many of the businesses they've acquired, right? Just check out Nokia, only an $8 billion write-off. That was easy, right? So now here's a very interesting example, right? Salesforce.com. You're not going to win a Nobel Prize for coming up with the idea that we're not going to make you buy an enterprise license for millions of dollars, but boy, did this idea have a run, right? So we're a software company that doesn't sell you software, okay? First company ever to get to $6 billion in revenue, or the fastest ever, okay? Running at a $45 billion market cap today, okay? Now here, anybody in Montreal know the company Akizio? Okay, so I was lucky enough to get a chance to mentor some of the Akizio founders 6 or 7 years ago when they were getting started. They did a brilliant job of replicating Salesforce.com. They targeted small to mid-sized digital agencies with a very amazing UI, because people running digital agencies were not IT people, with a product that was priced for them, and it was all about delivering reports around, pay-per-click campaigns. And the model was so effective, the pain point in the value prop was so powerful, that we got down to what we called a 2-hour close. Imagine selling enterprise software in 2 hours, a Quebec company, largely a Francophone founding group, selling software in 2 hours to enterprises in the United States, in Texas, for example, okay? But that's when you know you've got the right business model. This thing, the velocity of this business model was amazing, okay? We all know this company, okay? But boy, did they foment a revolution. So Uber has been replicated and then replicated again, okay? How many of you are working on a sharing economy model as we speak? Okay, relatively few in this room, which is surprising. That's not common when I ask for a show of hands, okay? Now, I know many of you who don't live in Silicon Valley or don't live in Boston or New York think, if only I had access to decisive venture capitalists where there was a lot of money. It's just about money. If I had a lot of money, all of my problems would go away. Let me, as sure as I am standing here, that may be the biggest fallacy ever. Okay, so let me take you to a different time and place. Okay, let me take you to 1999 and 2 very different companies. One of them known as Webvan. Webvan raised $1 billion in capital, and they recruited the CEO of Accenture, which was an insane coup to get this gentleman to come and run the company. The other company was Peapod, okay? Now, when you start any business, right, to me, it's very simple. The first order of business is I empty my mind. I don't care that I've had a bunch of successful startups before. I don't know anything until I engage the market. I am not imposing a business model on the market. I am searching for a business model, right? I am creating a set of hypotheses and then looking to validate whether those hypotheses are true or not. So the first thing you do is you search for a business model, and only when you get to product market fit in the lean startup methodology, then do you start to scale that business model. That's exactly the way that Uber did it. They started in San Francisco, and they went to a couple of cities. Airbnb started in Austin, Texas, around South by Southwest. You lock down the business model, and only then, when you get to product market fit, do you scale. That's not the way it went down for Webvan. Okay, so Webvan did not go in with this humble, curious mindset that we have a hypothesis about the validity of this grocery delivery business. They were damn sure, okay? That's your first problem, right? How many of you are comfortable and use the business model canvas as an ongoing tool, ongoing framework to keep track of your businesses? Okay, relatively few of you, okay? And I will tell you right now that what I am so stunned by, because whenever someone comes up to me and says, I want to talk to you about my business, the only rule I have, I'll talk to anybody about their business, but I say, I need you to put it into either a lean value canvas or to a business model canvas first, because it's going to give you a level of clarity that you've never had before about your business. But the very heart of both the lean value canvas and the business model canvas are these 2 areas where you have your target segment defined as precisely as possible, and you have the value proposition, okay? And what you are basically doing is you're using a value proposition canvas, okay? And you are, for each of your target stakeholders, what jobs are they trying to get done, or what are they trying to get done in their life if it's a business to consumer orientation? What are the pains, the frustrations, the annoyances, the obstacles that they face in getting that job done? And what are some of the gains that they're looking for? And then let me hypothesize about the solution. How do I remediate that pain? And how do I then go in and potentially give them some upside on the solution, right? And this is where we start to test our minimum viable product. We use the lean value canvas, we use the value prop canvas, and this is our MVP. And then what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to go out and validate that, right? Product with minimalistic features. Webvan did not do that. Webvan assumed that their business model was sacred, and they started investing in property, plant, and equipment. And they also started to believe that they needed to do everything on day one, so they decided that they would not just be a grocery delivery business, they would actually become a supermarket. And they would compete with all of the existing supermarkets that exist, okay? So every startup has a chance to pivot or persevere, okay? And this is, again, language coming right out of Lean Startup. Well, guess what? They persevered, all right. They persevered right off the cliff. And you can literally take $1 billion of smart money if you are unwilling to have the humility to go in the market and ask questions to validate your hypothesis and pivot when you find out that your ideas are not as good as you think they are, because rarely are they. Now, Peapod took a very different approach. They did go in with a lot more humility, and they understood that people wanted to continue to buy products from the grocery stores they'd been patronizing their whole lives, but what they wanted was someone who could help them bring home a lot of the commodity products that they needed on a regular basis, right? And so Peapod started off with a fraction of the capital of Webvan, but guess what? 15 years later, Peapod is a thriving business, okay? And a lot of it is attributable to the fact that they validated the business model in a lean startup concept in a way that makes complete sense today, okay? So, control your destiny or someone else will. That's my last Jack Welch quote. I can only give you 3. I know I've hit my limit with you guys on Jack Welch, okay? So how do you do this, okay? Whether you are running your company and you realize that maybe your business model isn't getting you the kind of velocity that you need, you haven't gotten to product market fit yet, whether you're starting to be approached by customers around the edges of your business and you see some new adjacent opportunities and you have certain known things because you know the customer base, but you're trying to deliver additional value, or whether you were starting a completely new company or a new product line from scratch, right? You're going to use the same process, okay? Again, you're searching for a business model first. Only when you get there do you raise real capital, hire people, and scale the company, okay? So here's the canvas, of course, but let me just take you through this. This is something that you can also find online, and I'm on Twitter. I'll give you my Twitter, and I'll post the links to these things, okay? The first thing is you've got to be very aware of the ecosystem, and you have to understand that there's so much convergence happening today, okay? That boundaries are being crossed. There are very few pure plays. So you need to understand all of the people that are delivering value that is adjacent to you. The second thing you need to do is you need to make sure that the people sitting around the table with you are very diverse, okay? And again, it defies human nature. When I teach, I tell my students, I don't want 5 MBAs on a team. I want a couple of you from the finance program. I want a couple of you from the social entrepreneurship program. But what do I normally get? 5 Chinese kids in the MBA program, okay? 5 Indian kids from the finance program, okay? 5 American kids from the marketing program, right? And the problem is you get groupthink, and there's nobody there to be a devil's advocate and to challenge conventional wisdom, okay? So it's really critical that you overcome the current business logic. The first time someone says, we've always done it this way, tell them they need to leave the meeting for an hour, okay? Because if that's the way that they're going to contribute to your team, that's probably not going to be very valuable into the long term, okay? You've got to start thinking more in business models, right? A product is a part of your business model, right? It's a vehicle that gives you the ability to solve a problem, but I can tell you about many companies that had very innovative products wrapped in very obsolete business models, and we will never know their names because they have failed, okay? And one of the most common things I see, especially here, because I know a lot of the folks here are still from Quebec, is that in the B2B space, a lot of entrepreneurs still don't understand how much selling has changed. And you're still trying to create these large sales forces that wear Armani suits and Ferragamo loafers to work every day, and they're on expense account, okay? I promise you, when I bring these startups in to see my VC friends, within 5 minutes, that meeting is done. Go back and do your homework, okay? So do not wrap a great product in an old business model. It's gonna fail every single time, okay? Let me go back and just talk about one thing too. Overcoming internal resistance. So one of my startups, we had raised a lot of money from some top-tier investors. And just like Flip got disrupted, one day a massive announcement got made in our space. And it was very clear that we had to dramatically pivot. I mean, almost basically a hard reset. And I remember very vividly sitting with my CEO, who was a very macho guy, and he almost came across the table for me to grab at my lungs. And I realized this may sound implausible, but for him to hear from one of his key guys, his key strategy guy, that there have been some things that have happened in the market that essentially make us irrelevant. And if we don't completely change our business model, we are of no value to anybody. It was an extremely awkward moment for the company. Ultimately, we decided to do it, and we went from creating a proprietary virtualization fabric to building management stack on top of the open source Zen hypervisor. It turned out to be exactly the right thing, but there was a lot of pain in that discontinuity, a lot of pain in that disruption. But every day that you're in denial is a day that your competition gets ahead of you, okay? So I know we're about to run out of time, so let me just show you one last slide, okay? And this slide is a very powerful slide. What this slide does is it maps 20 of the 55 business models, okay? Including the open source, the commercial open source model, which in many people thought was an oxymoron. How do you make money giving stuff away for free? Well, Red Hat has done a brilliant job. So the Red Hat model, that became the Threadless model. Threadless is a remarkable company. That became Amazon Mechanical Turk, okay? Or Dell creating their e-commerce business in 1998, one of the pioneers in e-commerce, and watching that go into Spreadshirt. And then we've got up here, we've got the auction model, okay? And then the subscription model with Netflix. So Netflix feeds into Nintendo Wii, that feeds into Nestle Specialty, right? So in some cases, I can trace business models back to the early 1900s. And I can see how some of the iconic companies that have revolutionized their industry have sought inspiration, have done creative. Remember Steve Jobs said, great artists steal, okay? There's nothing wrong than stealing a great business model that can deliver value to your clients. And so for those of you who are interested, okay, there are actually these 55 pattern templates that are available. So you can actually look at each of these different business models, get a deeper understanding of how they might apply to your target customer, to the value that you're trying to deliver, okay? Startups are about building on the shoulders of others, okay? So there's no need to reinvent the wheel. And if I look at this new generation of iconic companies, how many of you use Slack? Slack is the fastest growing business app in history today, okay? Fastest growing business app in history. And they're standing on the shoulders of people that are doing subscription and network, okay? So I hope that gave you some insight into how you might begin to think differently about what I believe is the single most important investment that you can make in your startup, which is to create the business model that really defines you and defines your industry. Thank you.